If you have been wondering about what camera to buy, but are overwhelmed with all the different options out there, then this video is for you. You could probably say that it's never been easier to buy a camera because the technology has been just so great over the last few years, and it keeps improving. It might seem very easy to pick a camera and say that you can't go wrong. However, making an informed decision of which camera to get will better suit you in the long run. By the end of this video, you learn about cameras around the $2,000 mark and under that I would personally consider. I'll also tell you a bit more about why I'm still holding off on upgrading my 3-year-old camera, but more on that a bit later. All the prices I'll be giving you in this video are current prices at the time of the making of this video, so there might be sales that you can get, or you may be able to pick up one of these cameras in the used market. So keep that in mind. So let's get started with cameras under the $1,000 mark. The first one is the Canon R50, which came out in 2023. It is about $679 US. It is an APS-C camera with a 24 megapixel sensor. In terms of some of the pros, it is super compact. It can shoot 4K up to 30 frames per second. It has good autofocus, a vertical video mode, and also HDR PQ video 10-bit, which is not to be confused with 422 10-bit color. In terms of some of the cons, because it is an RF camera, there are limited RF lenses available, although this seems to be improving with Canon finally opening up their licensing to third-party lens manufacturers. There is no headphone port, no 4K at 60 frames per second, no built-in stabilization. The video is only 8-bit, there is no log shooting, and it lacks a full mechanical shutter. The next one is the Nikon Z30, which came out in 2022, and that is about $700. It is also an APS-C camera with a 20 megapixel sensor. It has 4K at 30 frames per second, a tally lamp, and a weather sealed body. In terms of some of the cons, there are limited lens choices, there is no viewfinder, no built-in stabilization, there's no headphone port, no 4K at 60 frames per second, there's no log shooting, and it's only 8-bit video. The next one is a Fujifilm X-M5, which came out very recently in 2024. It is about $800, and it is an APS-C camera with a 26 megapixel sensor. It has 6.2K open gate 3:2 video up to 30 frames per second. That's a very technical thing when it comes to video, but just know that open gate is really good for video. You can shoot 4K up to 60 frames per second with a crop. You have Fujifilm's film simulation mode. There is a microphone and a headphone port. There is F-Log 2 in 422 10-bit color. And it also has the same sensor that is used in some of the more expensive Fujifilm cameras. In terms of the cons, autofocus is not as good as the competition. There is no built-in stabilization. And although they do have digital stabilization, it comes with a bit of a heavier crop. The next camera is the Canon R10, which came out in 2022, and it's about $900. This is also an APS-C camera with a 24 megapixel sensor. Some of the pros is that it's quite compact. It shoots 4K 60, albeit with a crop. It has really good autofocus, and similar to the Canon R50, it has HDR 10-bit video. Again, this is not to be confused with log video shooting in 422 10-bit. In terms of some of the cons, again, limited RF lens selection, there is no headphone port, no built-in stabilization, no log shooting, and only 8-bit color. And the last one on this list is the Sony CVE-10 Mark II, which came out also in 2024. It is an APS-C camera with 26 megapixels. This camera can record video in 4K 60 with a slight crop. It can shoot in Sony's S-Log3 in 422 10-bit color. It has a dual native ISO, LUT support, an external mic and headphone ports, and a lot of lens options because it is a Sony E-mount camera, and there are a ton of lenses out there from Sony and also from other third-party companies that have lenses for Sony E-mount. Some of the cons are that there is no viewfinder and there's no in-body built-in stabilization and also no mechanical shutter. From this list, I would pick the Sony CVE-10 Mark II or the Fuji X-M5. Both of these have better video recording options, with the Fujifilm having open gate recording, but because I have been traditionally a Sony user and I already have Sony lenses, I would go with the Sony camera. If you wanted to save some money, you could go with some of the cheaper ones, but the Fujifilm X-M5 is already on a very budget-friendly side, so that could be one to get if you want to save money. Let me know which one you would pick out of this list, and if there's a camera that should be in this list that was not included, let me know in the comments below. If you're finding value out of this video, please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and hit the like button if you're enjoying this so far. So next we have the cameras under the $2,000 range. In this list, there are 2 full-frame cameras, and the rest of them are APS-C crop sensor cameras. Let's start with the cheapest one out of this list, and that is the Fujifilm X-S20 that came out in 2023. It is an APS-C camera with a 26 megapixel sensor, and it costs about $1,300 US. In terms of some of the pros is that it has 6.2K open gate recording up to 30 frames per second. It can also record 4K up to 60 frames per second with no crop. It has built-in stabilization, a good battery life, and can also shoot f-log 2 in 422 10-bit color. In terms of some of the cons, the autofocus is not as good as the competition, and it is not weather sealed. For about $100 more, you can get the Sony a6700 that came out in 2023. So that will set you back $1,400. It is also an APS-C camera with a 26 megapixel sensor, and this camera has a ton of pros, a ton of features. You can do 4K at 120 frames per second with no crop. You can shoot in S-Log 3 at 422 10-bit color. It has great autofocus, built-in stabilization. It is weather sealed, it has LUT support. There are lots of lens options, dual native ISO, and a very good battery life. And honestly, I couldn't find any cons with this camera. Overall, it's a very good camera for its price. The next one is the Canon R8 that came out in 2023. This is a budget-friendly, entry-level full-frame camera. This camera costs about $1,500, and it's a full-frame camera with 24 megapixels. It can shoot 4K up to 60 frames per second with no crop. It is weather sealed. It has C-Log 3 in 422 10-bit color. It has great autofocus, and it even has false color display, which will come in very handy when you're shooting video. In terms of some of the cons, the battery life is not good, it has no built-in stabilization, and the lens options are limited. If you pay about $100 more, you're able to get the Fujifilm X-T5, which came out in 2022. This camera is about $1,700. It is an APS-C camera with 40 megapixels. In terms of some of the pros, you're able to get 6.2K at 30 frames per second with a crop, 4K at 60 frames per second with a slight crop, and you're able to shoot in f-log 2 at 422 10-bit color. It has built-in stabilization, it is weather sealed, it can shoot raw video externally, and it also has dual card slots. In terms of some of the cons, this camera does not have a fully articulating screen, just a tilting screen. The autofocus is not as good as the competition. The video quality is also not that good, and there is a lot of rolling shutter. Now closing in on the $2,000 mark, we have the Fujifilm X-H2, which came out in 2022. This camera is $2,000. It is an APS-C camera with also 40 megapixels. Some of the pros of this camera is that you can shoot at 8K at 30 frames per second, 4K at 60 frames per second with a slight crop. You can shoot in f-log 2 in 422 10-bit color. There is built-in stabilization, it is weather sealed, it has dual card slots, a full-size HDMI port, and you can shoot raw video. In terms of some of the cons, again, autofocus is not as great as the competition. There is significant rolling shutter with this camera. The last two in this list are 2 Panasonic cameras, which are essentially the same camera, but with one being a little bit more expensive, having a little bit more video-centric features. So the first one is the Panasonic Lumix S5 Mark II, and the second one is the Panasonic Lumix S5 Mark II X. They both came out in 2023. The Lumix S5 Mark II is about $1,697, and the X model is a little bit more expensive at $2,200. They both are full-frame cameras with 24 megapixels. They both allow you to shoot at 6.2K with a 3x2 open gate capture up to 30 frames per second, and that is at 420 10-bit color. You're able to shoot also at 4K 60 with an APS-C crop. You can shoot in Vlog in 10-bit 422. There is LUT support. There are a ton of video-centric tools. There's an internal cooling fan, dual card slots, in-body stabilization, and a full-size HDMI. In terms of some of the cons, autofocus, although it's been improved on these cameras, is still not on par with the competition. Battery life is not great, and also lens options are limited. The X version, compared to the S5 Mark II, also has more data in video recording, so you get more quality out of your videos. There is SSD recording via USB-C and ProRes recording externally. So from all of these cameras from this list, if you wanted a full frame camera, you could go for the Canon R8 or the Panasonic Lumix S5 Mark II. I think the non-X version is already very capable, so if you wanted to save money, you could stick with that version. If you wanted an all-around camera that has a ton of features, a lot of lens options, and don't mind it being an APS-C camera, then I would go for the Sony a6700. So which one would you pick out of this list? Let me know in the comments below. And if there's one that is not included here, let me know as well. And the last two cameras are not exactly under $2,000. They are a little bit over $2,000, but I think they're worth mentioning. The first one is the Sony a7C Mark II that came out in 2023. This camera is about $2,200 US. It is a full frame camera with 33 megapixels. In terms of some of the pros, it can shoot 4K at 30 frames per second, oversampled from 7K. You can also shoot 4K 60, but with a crop. There is built-in stabilization, there is an AI processing unit. You can shoot in S-Log 3 in 422 10-bit color. There is great autofocus, LUT support, a lot of lens options available, and it is weather sealed. In terms of the cons, this camera only has one card slot. It does not have a full-size HDMI port, and it is prone to rolling shutter. The next camera is similarly priced, the Sony CVE1, which is about $2,200 US. It is a full frame camera with 12 megapixels. It can do 4K 60 with no crop. It has built-in stabilization. You're able to shoot in S-Log 3 in 422 10-bit color. Autofocus is great. There are a ton of lens options available. There is LUT support, and it is super compact. In terms of some of the cons, because it's more on the compact side, there's only one card slot. There is no full-size HDMI port, no viewfinder, and no mechanical shutter. So from these two cameras that are slightly over $2,000, I think they both are really good. I really like that they're Sony E-mount because there are a ton of lens options available. So I don't think you could go wrong with any of these. So there's been a ton of cameras that I've talked about so far, but there are a few more that I think are worth mentioning that are slightly over that $2,000 mark. So close to these cameras are the Sony a7 IV, the Nikon Z6 Mark III, the Fujifilm X-H2S, and the Canon R6 Mark II. So all of these cameras are about the $2,500 mark, and if you have a bit more of wiggle room from that $2,000 mark, these ones would be some to consider. In terms of my main camera right now, I'm still using the Sony a7 IV, which came out in 2021. I've been using this for about 3 years now since it first came out, and I'm honestly very happy with it. There are a ton of features with this camera and a few inconveniences like a crop in 4K 60 and rolling shutter. But for the most part, I've been very happy with this camera, and I think that I will continue to use this camera this year unless something changes. If the Sony a7 IV, the rumored Sony a7 IV, is to be released this year, then that would be what triggers me to change and upgrade from the Sony a7 IV. So we'll wait to see what happens. I've also made a more extensive list on which Sony camera to buy under $2,000. So if you're interested in Sony cameras, you can check out this video here, and I'll see you there.